was a sophomore in high school, I was reminded of two important truths in a really hard way. Life can change in an instant, and I'm not as invincible as I think I am. I remember it like it was yesterday when I found out some really hard news. During Labor Day weekend of my sophomore year of high school, I was playing MLB The Show 2010 in my room on the PlayStation 2. And as I was playing, my dad came up to my room and asked me, "Sam, did you see the email that your school just sent out?" And I said that I haven't looked. And before I could get out my computer and check my school email, my dad told me this news. And this is what he told me. There was a freshman at your school named Connor Gage, and he went with some of his friends and their families to a lake house for the holiday weekend. And Connor and some of his friends were jumping off of a dock at this lake house, and they were doing flips off this dock. And Connor did a flip, and when he did this flip, he hit his head, and he didn't come back up. He drowned, and he died. And when I heard this news, I was really shooken. Because literally less than 48 hours ago, I was with Connor in the same gym at basketball practice. I was also really sad for his family. In particular, I was really sad for his older brother because I knew him. He was a junior in high school at the time, went to the same high school I did. And this really started to hit me even more when I walked into school that Tuesday morning. I walked by his locker. There was a memorial there for him. And usually when I'd walk into high school, the school would be pretty loud, but it wasn't like that today. Today, it was silent. You could hear a pin drop. Today was going to be different. And it was. The life of someone we knew just ended unexpectedly. Now we had to ask ourselves, how are we going to process this? And as I share this story, there could be potentially personal examples that you're thinking of, how life changed unexpectedly for you. Maybe it was a loved one who passed away. Maybe you're thinking of other world events as well. Just how everything feels so unstable. Whatever it may be, we cannot deny that life can change instantly, and that in the grand scheme of things, our lives here on earth are pretty short. So how should we respond to these truths? One thing's for sure, I'm really thankful that the Bible isn't afraid to dive deep into these hard truths and these realities that we experience as humans. And the Psalms do a great job of expressing these thoughts and these emotions that we go through as humans. And we're going to be reading a psalm today. So the psalm that we're going to be reading and looking over today is Psalm 90. And I will warn you, this is a pretty intense psalm. But after I read this psalm, I'm going to give some background information and some context to help us see why this psalm is so intense. So now I'll read the psalm in its entirety, and it will be on the screen behind me. You can also follow along in your Bibles if you want to. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn people back to dust, saying, "Return to dust, you mortals. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. Yet you sweep people away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. In the morning it springs up new, but by evening it is dry and withered. We are consumed by your anger and terrified by your indignation. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. All our days pass away under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan. Our days may come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures. Yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. If only we knew the power of your anger. Your wrath is as great as the fear that is your due. Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Relent, Lord. How long will it be? Have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love, that we may sing for joy and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, for as many years as we have seen trouble. May your deeds be shown to your servants, your splendor to their children. May the favor of the Lord our God rest on us. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. Definitely some intense parts in that psalm. And you could be thinking to yourself this morning, well, maybe this would have been a good Sunday morning for me to sleep in, and you'll know next time to not come when I preach. But I will say this. I would prefer to be in community as I'm wrestling with these hard, intense passages instead of in isolation. So I do thank you for being here. And now as we dive in a little deeper, I do want to give a little bit of context to this psalm so it can help us understand why the writer of this psalm is writing so intensely. And so many scholars speculate that Moses is the one who wrote this psalm. And some believe this is one of the oldest psalms ever written, which would make sense if Moses wrote it. And in particular, many believe Moses wrote this when he was in the wilderness with the Israelites. So the Israelites and Moses were first in the wilderness as God used Moses to lead the people out of Egypt and out of slavery. And when the group of people were on this doorstep to the promised land, they sent 12 spies, one from each tribe of Israel, to give a report about the land. And when those spies came back, there were 2 spies that gave a great report. They said, we got this, God is on our side, we can take this land. However, there were 10 spies that spread fear in the camp. And they talked about how big these people were and how much stronger these people were compared to them. And because of this, the Israelites had fear and they began to complain and began to lament and to doubt that the Lord could deliver them into this land. And they were also very upset with Moses and Aaron. In fact, they were so upset with them both, they tried to kill them. And they also asked God, why, God, did you bring us out here so we could die and so our loved ones would be in captivity? And because of this unbelief that God could deliver them into this situation and deliver them into the promised land, this generation, everyone over 20 in this generation, would die in the wilderness, and they would not get to enter the promised land. The only 2 in this group would be Joshua and Caleb. We would see the people of Israel wander in this wilderness for 40 years, and they would die off. So that's the overarching context of this psalm. And some scholars more specifically believe this was written around the time of Numbers chapter 20, which 3 really big things happen in this chapter. 1, Miriam, who is Moses' sister-in-law, Aaron's wife, dies. 2, Moses and Aaron disobey the Lord. The Lord tells them to strike to speak to a rock to get water because the people are wanting water, but instead of doing that, they strike it. And because they disobeyed God, the Lord told them they weren't going to enter the promised land either. So he's probably reflecting on that, Moses. And then third, Aaron dies in this chapter as well, and the Israelites mourn for 30 days. And again, I shared that with you because I think it can help us understand why Moses is using this really intense language and why he's reflecting upon this, because he is seeing directly the consequences of their sin, their complaining, and he's experiencing a little bit of God's strict and really hard discipline, his wrath, his indignation, right? And we also see in verses 7 through 11 just how life sometimes feels really heavy, right? And I feel like Moses is definitely experiencing that a little bit here. Imagine being a leader of a people that you know most of them are going to die off. That wouldn't have been very easy. And I think also looking at the background can just remind us of this as well. It's something that really stuck out to me in one of my classes for grad school this past semester. I think sometimes we get this sense that the people who wrote the Bible or the people who are in the Bible and that we hear their stories, they're not really people. Like, it's kind of like we kind of distance ourselves from them, you know? But the reality is they are people just like us, right, who have been through a lot. And so I want us to think about that as well as we dive into this psalm and how Moses processed this and how we can process this today and what we can learn from this psalm. And so I want to look at the first two verses. We're going to kind of break the psalm kind of bit by bit. So the first two verses talk about how the Lord is their dwelling place, and he's been their dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. And it is important to note as we're going through this psalm is that the Psalms are poetic in nature. So Moses is using imagery and metaphors to help us grasp truths about God that he and the people of Israel were experiencing, and that we also experience too. And what's interesting to me is that to begin this psalm, which a lot of it is reflecting on us and reflecting on death, but Moses begins first on focusing on God and his character. First, Moses calls the Lord their dwelling place, which also could refer to refuge. That's another way you could translate that. So Moses is saying that the Lord is their refuge, their protection, their security, and their provider, even though they're in the middle of the wilderness, where you really wouldn't think they would have this, but they do in God. And then after this, Moses proclaims that this hasn't just begun now, right now in this situation. He has always been that for the people of Israel. And then in verse 2, Moses proclaims that God has always been. God is eternal. He doesn't have a beginning, and he doesn't have an end. And then the next part of the psalm, verses 3 through 6, begin to show again how God is eternal, he's everlasting. And it kind of compares us in God a little bit, humans and God. And we see in verse 3 that God is ultimately in control. Moses proclaims that he turns people back to dust. Another way to think about that is he returns people back to death. And that he, again, as I said before, is ultimately in charge. And we also see a contrast of time when it comes to God compared to us. For God, 1,000 years is like a day. We, on the other hand, are like the new grass in the morning. It springs up new, but by evening it is dry and withered. And as I was reflecting on these verses of the psalm, I was really convicted of something. I don't know if you have ever done this before, but I know for sure I have. There have been times in my life when I'm praying to God, I give God specific instructions in what he should do, and more specifically, what he should do for me. For example, oh God, if you just did this and this, then I'll do this for you, you know? But just make it quick, you know what I mean? And And as I was thinking about that and reading these verses, I was like, wow, it hit me differently. I got really convicted because as I was reading and reflecting upon these verses, I realized that God is so much bigger than me. I was reminded of that. And it's humbling to admit that, right? That God is so much bigger than I am. And of course, he'll know more than me. He sees the whole picture. I don't. Now, I'm not saying you can't ask God questions, because if you look through the Psalms, you're going to see the people who write the Psalms, they're going to ask a lot of questions. However, it's important when we are asking these questions that we don't demand God to give us an answer or think, oh, God, please give me the answer that I want. Because again, remember, he sees the whole picture. We don't. And then verses 7 of 11 in the Psalm are really the intense parts of the Psalm. I would argue the most intense parts. And this is the part where we get this language such as being consumed by anger. We're being consumed by our anger. We're terrified by our indignation. And we also see that God has knowledge of our brokenness, our frailty, and that we have all sinned against him. And as I said before, these verses really show us, too, how life sometimes can be heavy. In Moses, again, right, he's going through so much. First of all, he's probably wrestling himself that I'm not going to enter the promised land now. Also, again, he's seeing all these people die off, and he's seeing the consequences of their actions, of their sin against God. And again, I think it's important for us to reflect upon this truth as well, that there are consequences for sin even today, right? It might not happen like right away, but still there are consequences. And because of sin entering this world, the ultimate consequence for all of us, unless Jesus returns beforehand, is death. We will return to dust. And these verses, too, also reflect a little bit about how our time here on earth is relatively short in the grand scheme of things. Verse 10 talks about this we have 70, if our strength endures, 80 years. And it's important to note, though, that we shouldn't take this literally. Again, this is poetic language, and so the 70 to 80 years is to emphasize the futility of life. These specific years are a poetic estimate of a lifespan. And then, after these verses, we get to verse 12, which I would say is probably my favorite verse in this whole psalm. And in this verse, we see Moses ask God for something. So up to this point, Moses has reflected upon how time flies, life has its uncertainties, and that God judges sin. And after he's praying and reflecting on these things, and also how God is eternal, and that we as humans are not, he asks God to teach them to number their days so they could gain a heart of wisdom. And it's important to note that Moses asked the Lord to teach them this, which shows us this. This wisdom of numbering our days is something that doesn't come naturally. We have to be taught it. And it's also important to note that this doesn't mean literally number the amount of days you have left on earth. Grab a calendar and start counting and be like, oh, this is when I'm going to die, because the fact is, none of us know the exact day. But it's being aware that our life does have a number of days. We do live, and that there is an end. And Moses asking the Lord for wisdom to see this and to number his days shows us that we need to value the moments and the days that we have here on this earth, and that what the Lord has given us. It's a blessing. We need to understand that each day is important, that we have an opportunity to honor and glorify God with each day. And we need to live with purpose, and we need to live with this idea of one day at a time, live in the moment. I think asking God to teach us this, to number our days, can help us with two ways maybe sometimes we tend to view time, and they're kind of extremes. One is this mentality of, I'll just do that tomorrow. Oh, I'll have that conversation tomorrow. Or you know what, I feel like I should do this and this for this person, but you know what, I'll do that tomorrow. But maybe we need to be careful with that mentality, because what if tomorrow never comes for you and that person? Or what if the next day you say the same thing? I'll do that tomorrow. And then that next day you say, I'll do that tomorrow. And then at some point it's just too late to do that thing or to say that thing you were going to say to them, right? So kind of putting things off. But there's also another way that I think sometimes we view our days as well, is that we just want to rush them. This is more the mentality of, I just want to finish. Oh, I just want to finish high school so I can go to college. Oh, I just want to finish college so I can get a job. Oh, I want to get married so I can raise a family. It's kind of this classic not enjoying the journey, just focusing on the destination. But asking God to help us number our days and to learn this wisdom can help us be thankful and grateful for the situation that he has us in right now, right? For those who are in school, like, it's okay to want to graduate and go on to the next thing, but don't lose sight of the moments that you have right now in the present, right? Or if there's something you want, or you want to get to this place, like, don't lose sight, though, of what God has for you and what he might want to be doing through you right now. Be open. It's like we tell the kids at Vacation Bible School, watch for God. He is moving in the day-to-day. And it can be tempting to just coast through life or to try to rush through life and not think about death and not think about the moments we have right now. But if we do, we could very well miss opportunities that God has given us in this life to live for him and to live in a way that has eternal impact. Because I want us to see that, yes, life is short here on earth, and it is uncertain, but it can have significance. What I think is really interesting in this psalm is that after Moses talks about the judgment of God and he asks for wisdom to number their days, Moses intercedes to God for mercy and for grace. Even though Moses knows that he's not going to enter the promised land, he doesn't have this mentality of, you know what, now life's not worth living anymore. He's still praying, he's still communicating and connecting with the Lord. And he begins this part near the end of the psalm, verses 13 through 17, by asking God to relent. Or another way some translations translate this is return, which is interesting because earlier in this psalm in verse 3, Moses says that God returns people to dust, signifying death. But now Moses is pleading to God in this prayer, Lord, return to us as a people. There's this sense that Moses longs for the Lord to be with them again. He's longing for God's presence, mercy, and compassion. Because Moses is understanding, I believe, that the only way for their life to have meaning and for them to truly live is if the Lord comes to them again, even though they have sinned against him. And then in the last verse in this psalm, verse 17, we see Moses ask the Lord for him to establish the work of their hands. And he does this twice, which shows me that's pretty important. He asks God's favor to be with them. You see, Moses understood that life is short, and he also understood that the only way that his time on earth, the work that he does, everything, it's going to have a lasting impact, depends on God, in partnership with him, being in fellowship with him. And that's something that stuck out to me as I was reflecting upon the psalm as a whole. This psalm doesn't come out and say it directly, but I would argue that this psalm invites us to relate to God. I see this at the very beginning of the psalm and also at the very end. And what's so amazing about this is that there is a huge difference between God and us. Yet, this eternal God wants to relate to us here on earth where we really don't live very long. This truth about how we are finite and broken and sinful does not stop God from wanting to relate to Moses and the people, and it doesn't stop Moses from wanting God to relate to him and the people. And something that I also thought about is what this realization should lead us to. This God who is everlasting, he has always been, wants to relate to us. People who have not always been, who are broken, sinful, and fragile. And he wanted to relate to us so much that he sent his son to die so that we could live with him forever. What should our response be? What should your response be? And as you reflect upon that, I want to share with you how my school and myself responded to Connor's death. I remember that Tuesday morning we had a special chapel service. And I'll be honest, usually in high school chapels, we really didn't sing too much. We were too cool for that, I guess. But today was not like that at all. It was different. We were not focused on ourselves. We were worshiping God wholeheartedly. And we thanked God for the life that we thanked God for Connor's life, the time he did have on earth. And I also remember from that chapel service the speaker who talked about Connor. He talked about how much of an impact he had on the people around them, how much he loved them, how much he cared for them. And also he talked about the relationship that Connor had with the Lord and how much he loved Jesus. You see, Connor's life was short. But man, one thing I learned from that chapel service is that his life had a lot of significance. So a question I leave with you with, are you living a life that will be remembered in that way? Please pray with me. Jesus, I just want to say thank you for this day that you've given us. Each day is valuable, and we say thank you. Thank you for wanting to relate to us. Thank you for loving us. And Lord, it is so amazing. God, help us live each day with you in mind, and with the people we're around as well in mind. God, give us boldness and courage if there's something through your Spirit that you're convicting us to do. Help us go to you and help us rely on you, God. Lord, again, we are so thankful for this day, and we're so thankful that you want to relate to us. We love you, and we're so thankful for you. And in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.